Good morning. I'm so grateful to Ilkay and Duncan for being here. Just to get started very quickly, I thought we should sort of define some of the terms of what we're talking about. So could you guys speak to how you think of human resilience in the context of climate change?
I'll go. There are a number of aspects. I think there's an aspect of intelligence and understanding the Earth so that we can best intervene and interact with it. And then there is a question of how we best adapt to the changes that are going on and that we're experiencing at the moment. And I think Ilkay has a lot of experience in that.
Yeah, I think, as Duncan said, it's our ability to monitor, predict, adapt to, and mitigate from climate change is sort of the total of resilience.
So, Ilkay, as a scalable data system, wildfire can inform real-time resilience strategies, right? Can you give us a little snapshot about that?
Yeah, it's Larry smiling because we've been thinking about this for a while. Especially in San Diego, we experienced fire in 2003. It was, even earlier, but that was the big WUI, wild and urban interface fire we experienced in recent history. And it was devastating. We didn't know how to communicate. So the first thing about that was being able to monitor our environment and also understand what's going on. And, technology, of course, had a role, but also it's very human. It's like human understanding of fire, and their role in it was very important. So using sensing data, visualizations, this was some things we imagined 20 years ago. We are now there. I think Watch Duty has been really useful. For instance, it was doable, but the data wasn't there, and we have lessons to learn from that. But I think now our role in the wildfire program is going from that prediction and responsive, what we call reactive technology, which we need, from that fast reaction to more careful design of the landscapes and mitigating from what can happen, and going towards understanding through, controlled vegetation treatments or, designing our communities and interfaces to those fire-prone landscapes. So that's the resilience that we see.
Duncan, you're using advanced data as well, combining that with atmospheric science, kind of sorting out these complicated interactions between aerosols and cloud and climate. I really appreciate the way you describe aerosols as a parasol, not just because it rhymes. Practically, that shapes regional planning too, right?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I was a physicist by training, but coming into atmospheric science a little bit later on, what captivated me was the complexity of the system. There's so many moving parts. And understanding these details, it seems inconceivable that these microscopic particles can have such a kind of impact on a large scale. But these byproducts of burning fossil fuels, which then interact with the clouds and make the clouds brighter, and then are affecting the albedo of the Earth, and that is offsetting slightly some of the warming which we experience due to greenhouse gases. And so unpicking all those interactions and being able to determine how much of the warming we've seen is really due to the greenhouse gases, how much is a feedback in the system, and so on. And so with machine learning and AI, being able to interrogate the data, the petabytes of data we get from satellites and these big complex physical models, being able to distill that into understanding, which we can then use to improve our predictive models and better adapt and better plan for future changes is, it's fascinating. I love it.
So when you think about, we should kind of narrow, climate tech can be a lot of different things too. Sure. So narrowing that a little bit and thinking about AI and thinking about machine learning, how do you think about the best uses of that?
That's a great question. I think there are multiple facets. I think, as I say, on the kind of Earth intelligence side, so being able to interrogate these different data streams. I mentioned satellites, but we have, Scripps Oceanography, where I'm a faculty, develops and deploys these autonomous drones, which we drop into the ocean. They go off and they measure heat at 2,000 meters under the ocean, which is where most of the energy is going. And being able to combine that intelligently with models and with these other data streams that we have, I think is it's currently underutilized, I think, but AI gives us an opportunity to really harness that. And then the other aspect I'm particularly excited about is in terms of making these complex models more accessible. So building surrogates and emulators of these physical models, which are much more interactive and much more intuitive. And so putting those in the hands of policymakers and people who can act on this information, being able to drive innovation and change.
So I think you're speaking to it a little bit. What do you think the unlock is there? How do you get that to the proper utilization?
There's a technology question. So how do we bring to bear all these technologies in the scientific domain? And so there's a little bit of expertise kind of mismatch, I think, currently between the science domains and the AI domains. And I'm working to kind of bridge that, but there's work to do there. There's a question of just funding, just getting hours on those GPUs, and particularly building the training data is often an expensive component, but it's coming.
Yeah. Okay, you've described climate tech as deeply human. Do you want to talk a little bit more about how you see that? I don't know that when we talk about 17% of the public being in favor of it, there might be a disconnect in the broader understanding.
Yeah, it's human because it affects the humans more than anything. I think innovation in climate tech comes as a value when it's either beating or at least matching the speed of the challenge we're experiencing. And that really affects people. And we need to really look at it as not just innovation or tech for tech's sake, but bridging science to society in a way that comes from a youth-inspired perspective, how it affects the communities and how it changes their lives, and their ability to also understand what's going on and adapt to it. So that part of it, and since it's so much integrated into society, our climate or the changes in our environment and the extremes, just what Duncan was saying, being that warm in the ocean is actually like a wildfire for the marine life and ecosystems. So, as human beings, we are experiencing maybe the first changes through these extremes, but understanding that long-term effect and being able to communicate that through technology to communities makes it really very human, and also something that integrates into people's lives without even us noticing how deeply they're affected, right? There are lots of vulnerabilities in the face of climate change in the society. The ones who are affected the most are the ones actually are the most vulnerable. So that way I think it requires a different way of thinking about innovation and bringing science and data and tech into people's lives.
It can. I like that actually. One of the challenges with climate in particular is this difference in timescales, right? As you say, this where they're slowly cooking, frogs in the saucepan, and maybe the technology and the AI can bring that immediacy and can kind of make us kind of link those timescales and shortcut that a little bit, so we get that feedback.
There's a huge opportunity for AI. And explainability and interpretability is a part of AI. And what happens over the last 3 years, of course, we all experienced AI through actually a user interface through ChatGPT, right? Most of the society knows AI as a conversational tool. But what happened that's more important after that is this agentic way of looking at the world. So we actually have the opportunity to have a sidekick in our lives to navigate the world, and that includes climate tech. How to actually behave and do things that can be assisted through these technologies, and looking at our lifestyles differently, just like we now look at our health monitoring differently, most of us.
One of the challenges in doing that, obviously, is trying to train and imbue those models with knowledge of the science and a real kind of robust grounding. And I know there are people, yourself, and I'm working with groups as well in computer science to try and do that. But that's, I think, the current open challenge. Speaking to your unlock, right? How do you imbue these models with that reasoning and that robustness that means we can trust the answers that come out of it in a scientific sense.
I wonder whether both of your imagination about the climate tech that's most useful is climate tech that's filtered through a scientific process, filtered through like a public policy process. It sounds like, because we do have, thinking about climate tech, there's so much investment in, especially with the fires in recent years, there are so many sensor-based startups. They're kind of columnar. They're not necessarily wide-ranging, but you're talking about guardrails in a sense, and I'm curious about your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so I think there are certain things that is easy to wrap our heads around, and I see a lot of the investment going toward those areas. But I think the real opportunity, as you said, is to think a little deeper into what's the use and what kind of next steps can we use through better innovation toward that. And that requires some guardrails, because how can we develop these technologies with a long-term view of where we are going with it, and what are those policy and communication ecosystem around it that we need to think through. So a big part of that is, who is the user of the technology, and what do they need now, and what will they need in the long term? Like when we look at fire tech, which is an area I work in, we don't think of it as a 3-year innovation. We actually think of what's in 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, 50 years, and we try to imagine the world in those timescales. And sort of along with that, we think of in those timescales what would be useful, how can we make those useful things happen through usable prototypes today, so in 25 years they'll be used at scale. And climate tech is even more deeper because the timescales are longer. But even as extreme as the fires go today, in 50 years we're experiencing them in a very different way.
I want to return to fire tech, but Duncan, in your area, I wonder, the way that we most commonly talk about climate tech related to aerosols is kind of this short-term or potentially stopgap, this idea of seeding certain parts of the atmosphere. How do you think about climate tech? That's probably not your ideal imagination necessarily. So I'm curious your reaction to that, and also what you do think is what is a good example of a climate tech advancement in your area?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was when you asked about guardrails, that's where my brain went, because as you say, I mean, there are these kind of tantalizing stopgap kind of technologies that people are exploring, and some I think in a thoughtful and holistic way, and some maybe less so. And I think there are definitely opportunities to just go and innovate and disrupt, and in particular around the use of AI in research. There's not much you can do wrong, right? I mean, you build a model, and if it works, that's fantastic, and if it doesn't, or if it's slightly dubious, that gets kind of figured out in the literature pretty quickly. When you're going out there and into the desert and you're just releasing balloons of sulfur into the atmosphere, I mean, it doesn't do a huge amount of damage immediately, but there's a big perception risk and potential issues around what you're claiming it's doing and what it's actually doing. And so, in terms of actual things, climate tech that you could do that would be a safer kind of impact or innovation, I mean, things like battery tech, carbon dioxide removal, I think are big potential wins. I think they could be game changers if we get those right, and I think that's recognized in large parts of the community. But yeah, I'm wary about these aerosol injection techniques as a band-aid essentially.
It's interesting that you mentioned battery tech, because of course that kind of intersects with the problem of wildfires as we're seeing, right? Do you want to speak a little bit more to fire tech?
Yes, and one of the guardrails in fire tech is actually how do you share information? The pendulum swung a little too much to the other side from not sharing anything. Now there's a move towards everything being transparent without really understanding how people are actually interpreting what they're looking at. And the other part of, as it relates to aerosols, is, as you know, LA was one of the biggest hazmat operations in history after the fires because of Tesla's burning. Actually, that was in general, battery fires, right? Or how many batteries were left in the fires overall, our sort of expanded use of batteries overall. And there is an aerosol problem there too, because these are all connected complex systems. So when wildfires burn, in the wildlands, they are mainly biomass, trees burning or grass burning or more organic materials. No smoke is good for human beings, even in small scales. But those are still, depending on what's in the smoke, they are manageable. Whereas when the wildland-urban interface, especially things like batteries and building materials burning, we are talking about chemicals in the air, which becomes aerosols, and those aerosols carry in the air. So it's proven that, as aerosols travel, they coat molecules that seed into rain. So that brings drought, for instance. There are so many publications around aerosols, and there's no long-term studies of how these chemicals affect human beings. And we are not in a smoking section, non-smoking section in a building, because in 2020, 3 weeks after our grass fires, Barcelona was under smoke. In 2023 or 21, that smoke actually hit Canada's big smoke, hit Washington. We don't even know how that smoke affects those communities, or if it's the same type of chemicals. What happens to those aerosols as they travel and how their content changes? So there's so much science and research to be done for those to be available to climate tech. But the guardrails, I think, come from, in one part of a complex system, we are doing investments in policies, and it affects the next part.
Another great example was the Australian wildfires. There were these huge wildfires, 2019, I think they were. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the smoke from that got so high, it went right around the world. It went eastwards and came all the way right back across the Indian Ocean, all the way nearly back to Australia. And there was a big paper a couple of years ago which indicated that perhaps those contributed to the El Nino that we felt a year or two later. And so, as you say, there are these interactions and complexities that we're only just starting to unpick. And so I think that fundamental research is really key.
And that can inform how we think about it both privately and publicly, right?
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
I mean, we have, in the United States, we don't make wildfire smoke kind of a pollution that we control under the Clean Air Act. Batteries are this rising, even though we're trying to recycle more metal materials, we're having more battery-related incidents, not just in the wildfires, but we also had one in the Central Coast of California at a battery facility. We have battery explosions at every metal scrapyard. There was a terrible fire in Berkeley that was the source of some criminal indictments related to that as well. So intersectionality, it's funny because when I started reading both of your work, it seemed quite separate, but it's actually quite related. How do you think about how these problems affect people who are the most vulnerable? How do you think about using, say, machine learning to sort of think through that problem, given the potential biases there as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I try and think about this more and more in my work because, we in the West have this a lot of adaptation capacity, right? We are fortunate in that many of the worst aspects of climate change we were able to deal with. It's expensive, very expensive in some cases. Cleaning up the wildfires was tens, hundreds of billions of dollars. We build flood defenses in Florida or in the Northeast. But, at the end of the day, if we improve the grid, we can turn the AC up. But there are large parts of the world, in Southeast Asia, for example, that are suffering from astonishing heat waves over the last couple of years that I think we would find intolerable in the West. And the question of how we enable those people to build the capacity to adapt to that, I think, is a key question. I talk a lot about, I mean, the other aspect of emulating the climate models, I talked about policymakers. I sometimes talk about democratization of those models as well, making them open to developing nations. I haven't done enough of that, perhaps, but I think the principle is there. But I also sometimes wonder about the risk that those countries decide that actually they go and break the glass fire alarm, right, and pull this lever of geoengineering because they don't have anything else. And actually, you know, in that moment, in that place, that's the logical, immediate solution. And exactly as Ilkay described, we have no idea what the consequences for even a local emission of these things would cause on the rest of the world.
Right. Is that a capitulation or is that an advancement? Right. Well, we are getting to the question of where do you see this going in? Ilkay, as you talk about, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. How do you think about investments now in technology that would help resilience? What would you like to see if you were in control? Which, of course, you're not.
I would hit the fundamental research button again. I mean, particularly in light of the federal funding cuts and the dramatic cuts to NSF and others, I feel like for decades that's been shown to be a fantastic return on investment, producing unexpected and completely unknown innovations down the road. So I think that could and should remain a focus. But you're much closer to kind of some of the on-the-ground technologies that might...
And let me quickly just welcome you down here to ask us questions as we near the end of this session. Ilkay, I want you to answer, but I also wanted to let you know that we're open for questions very soon.
Yeah, I think a big part of this is the innovation models we built don't scale to this type of societal scale, change and innovation. And we need to find new ways of innovating together. Cross-sector labs, for instance, we need more of those, that we have all kinds of sectors coming together to look at the needs from the practice, from the ground, meeting the science and the challenge, because especially in this area, science is evolving with the challenge. And I recently launched a whole lab on this, Societal Computing and Innovation Lab, and our main problem that we are looking at there is how do you actually innovate when that innovation is uniquely possible at the cutting edge science, AI, computing, technology. It's so hard right now to move the science into innovation in this current sort of methods we have. But I think when we build it in a way that we can create a lab environment, that science meets innovation faster and accelerates progress.
And I see our super moderator, Barrett, has a question.
Yeah, I'm curious. Hi, Duncan. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about geoengineering. You mentioned you made some kind of like dangerous, moody allusions to it, but I'm curious to hear more of your research and concerns about and about what specific technologies or approaches.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there are a number of ways of doing this. The one that gets at the root cause of the problem is carbon dioxide removal. I don't have any particular issue with that. There are major technological issues in how we actually implement that, but that could be a way of getting rid of certainly the last few megatons of CO2. Shortwave, so solar radiation management is a kind of other way of doing this. So you reflect a bit of sunlight back to space that offsets the warming we get from greenhouse gases. And we, as I mentioned, are already doing that to some extent with the aerosols that we emit. The key challenge is that can only be a very short-term intervention because the CO2 that we have emitted stays there basically forever. And so it can only be a stopgap until we remove that CO2. And there are these unknown, as I mentioned, offsets. It's not a perfect antidote, right? The greenhouse gas warming goes through a mechanism, which I don't have time to describe here, and this radiation management is a different mechanism, and they don't perfectly balance. And so the risks are that a country decides that they have to do this, and it may well call that country locally or regionally, but there could be downstream effects on precipitation over the Sahel or in the Californian Valley, which are maybe unprovable, but may be there, may not be there, and so that leads to all these really complicated socio-political, geopolitical issues. And also the societal risks. There are various hazards, right? We talk about the moral hazard, right? The fact that by doing this, perhaps we just kick the can further down the road and we put off actually reducing emissions. That being said, I think there are useful things we can research, given that we may not be the people that decide whether or not to do it.
It's a bit like giving a painkiller to a patient without looking at the root cause of it.
100%.
Hi, Ann Verdevec. I have a question. Are you using AI at all to investigate nature's prior solutions to some of these problems? For example, old growth forests can move moist air from the oceans thousands of miles inward, but as we're cutting them down, we're losing that ability. So I'm hoping perhaps that there is ability to look at some of nature's solutions and incorporate them into some of the solutions you're working at through AI. So if you could comment.
Yeah, Duncan definitely can give more examples there. And one thing we are doing is looking at, this fire deficit. That's actually one of the causes for the fires we are having. What that means is we suppressed every fire we can, stopping nature's sort of healthy processes for more than 100 years now, especially more in the last 50 years. And that sort of resulted in really flammable landscapes. And one of the things we are doing is understanding in this climate regime what's healthy, not 50 years ago, and developing land objectives and priorities to reduce fire risk so we can treat those landscapes. And one of the ways to treat that is lower intensity forms of fire, for instance. But again, it needs to be done very carefully, because what meant healthy 50 years ago does not mean that it's healthy now. And also, the impact of the treatment of those landscapes, what kind of side effects will they have? So there's a lot of work going on, right? And awareness, right? Building awareness around it toward policies.
Thank you so much. We are out of time, and so I hope we can address your question out in the hallway. I know we were just talking about changes from 50 years ago, and that was a conversation we had on the bus this morning. So thanks so much for your attention.